Okay, here we go, the Supreme Octet. I will read this and then we will go through it and I will talk about it and then I will stop talking and we will discuss it together. So the Supreme Octet. When dwelling on views as supreme, a person makes them the utmost thing in the world, and from that calls all others inferior, and so he's not gone beyond disputes. When he sees his own advantage in what's seen, heard, sensed, or in habits and practices, seizing it there, he sees all else, all others, as inferior. That too, say the skilled, is a binding knot. That independence on which you regard another as inferior, so a monk shouldn't be dependent on what's seen, heard, or sensed, or on habits and practices, nor should he theorize a view in the world in connection with knowledge or habits and practices. Shouldn't take himself to be equal, shouldn't think himself inferior or superlative. Abandoning what he'd embraced, not clinging, he doesn't make himself dependent even in connection with knowledge, doesn't follow a faction among those who are split, doesn't fall back on any view whatsoever. One who isn't inclined towards either side, becoming or not, here or beyond, who has no entrenchment when considering what's grasped among doctrines, hasn't the least theorized perception with regard to what's seen, heard, or sensed. By whom, with what, should he be pigeonholed here in the world? This Brahman who hasn't adopted views. They don't theorize, don't yearn, don't adhere even to doctrines. A Brahman not led by habits or practices, gone to the beyond, such doesn't fall back. So, as with all the things we've been doing, this is one of my very favorites. The Supreme Octet, comes out of the fifth basket of suttas in the Sutta, in the Pali Canon, the Sutta Nikaya. There's the four collections of discourses that people are most familiar with: long, short, collected, and numerical. The Khuddaka Nikaya is the fifth basket. It includes, among other things, the Therigatha and the Therigatha, which are these poems of the enlightened monastics or the monks and nuns. It includes the Jataka tales, those tales of Buddha's past lives. It includes the Patisambhidimoga, which is a rather intellectual text, the Dhammapada, and it includes the Sutta Nipata. The Sutta Nipata is a rather longer, and it includes a couple of commentaries on the Sutta Nipata actually. But the Sutta Nipata is a larger collection of sutras which includes the Metta Sutta and a couple of others you might be familiar with. And it includes a collection. One of the books in there is called the Attakavagga, which is the Book of Eights. So called because there's, I don't know, 15 or 16 different sets of verses in there, and they're each made up, as is this one, of 8 verses. So if you look, there's 8 verses in this Supreme Octet. They cover a number of different areas, but about half of them are focused on not holding views. There's a book by Gil Fronsdal that Elizabeth, who was with us and left, actually gave me a while ago. I can't remember what it's called, but it's Gil Fronsdal actually talking about the Attakavagga and giving commentaries on them. And like the Dhammapada, they are very early teachings, so they don't have the lists, they don't have a lot of the doctrine, they're very basic and clear. Other ones in there are the Udana and the I can't remember the other word, but these are short collections of sutras that are very pithy in their individual conversations or exclamations of the Buddhas. So anyway, so this they're about, a lot of these are about views, and they're really, really powerful. So it's demolishing views and telling us not to hold views. As a precursor, there is one right view. Right view is a clear understanding of the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path is Buddha's very basic teaching broken into 4 pieces. It's basically, I teach 2 things. I teach suffering and I teach the end of suffering. So right view is that this practice is a practice that leads to the end of suffering. That's it. So, dwelling on views as supreme, we're now talking about all other views. When dwelling on views as supreme, a person makes them the utmost thing in the world, and from that calls all others inferior. I know an awful lot of Buddhists. An awful lot of Buddhists. In fact, I dare say most of the Buddhists I know hold their Buddhist views, their Buddhist faith, very close to the exclusion and slight denigration of other faiths. And it's worse, it's like the smoker who quit smoking. He's the most belligerent in the world. People who were born and raised in other faiths and then find in Buddhism the one true religion, they can be pretty narrow. We can be pretty narrow. So this really is one to be really, really careful of. Really careful of. When he sees his own advantage in what's seen, heard, sensed, or in habits and practices, seizing it there, he sees all else, all others, as inferior. That too, say the skilled, is a binding knot. The 4 clingings aren't specifically listed here, but it's worth reflecting, I think, on the 4 clingings, which is one of the teachings. The 4 clingings are of sensuality, which is what's seen, heard, and sensed. Cling to what we see, what we hear, what we sense. One of the 4 clingings is views, clinging to views. A 3rd clinging is habits and practices. Now, habits and practices become deeply ingrained, and they're invisible, just like a lot of our views, which can also be deeply ingrained. It's kind of hard to see them, but we really can cling to them. And the last of the 4 clingings is a sense of self, and he talks about a sense of self as we get into here. So a lot of this is about, it touches on all the clingings. It's really focused on views, but it's really about making sure we let go of everything, absolutely every last thing we're holding on to. Let that tail of the ox come through the window. So a monk shouldn't be dependent on what's seen, heard, or sensed, or on habits and practices, nor should he theorize a view in the world in connection with knowledge, habits, and practices. Shouldn't take himself to be equal, shouldn't think himself inferior or superlative. There is a wonderful practice, the practice of exchanging self with others, which is taught in the Tibetan tradition. It comes out of Shantideva's way of the Bodhisattva. And it's exactly this. Find somebody who you think is equal, and in your mind exchange places with them and see them as equal to you. Find somebody you think is inferior, and in your mind exchange places. So we're playing with this role of inferior and superior and equal, and looking at how ridiculous it is. Just flat out ridiculous. But it's just our nature to naturally fall into this. Abandoning what he'd embraced, not clinging, he doesn't make himself dependent even in connection with knowledge, doesn't follow a faction among those who are split, doesn't fall back on any view whatsoever. There are a handful of suttas in the Canon where the Buddha identifies, I actually brought this so I could look up some of these questions to, this is Tenisero, Skill in Questions. So there are 3 categories of questions put aside. They're to do with the cosmos, the metaphysics of the cosmos or the universe, the nature and existence of the self, and the existence of or non-existence of a Tathagata after death. Very well then, Master Gautama. Is it the case that the cosmos is not eternal? Only this is true. Anything otherwise is worthless. Buddha won't answer that. Very well then, Master Gautama. Is it the case that the cosmos is finite? Is it the case that it's infinite? Is it the case that it's eternal? Now then, Venerable Gautama, is there a self? Then is there no self? By whom was this being created? Where is the being's maker? Where has the being originated? Where does the being cease? Could go on. These are the kind of questions that people will come to the Buddha and they'll lob at the Buddha, and the Buddha just won't take them on. Most questions he'll either answer directly, or if it's a question that needs redirecting, he'll engage in a conversation to redirect and help the individual either find the right question which they can answer themselves, or redirect to a question that actually makes sense. These ones he just won't touch. These are unanswerable questions, because these take us to views. Does the Tathagata exist after he dies? Same. Does the Tathagata not exist after he dies? Same. Both exist and not exist? Neither exist nor not exist. The same. These cannot be answered. So if pause for a minute and just think about what that looks like. You've got this, what looks to you like a person sitting in front of you, your teacher, and you're calling him Buddha, the Tathagata, and you ask this individual, will they exist after they die? And they will not land on an answer as to whether they exist or they don't exist, or they both exist and don't exist, or they neither exist nor don't exist. And that is the reality from that side. Total elimination of all views about whether Tathagata actually exists. What is that like? That's where we're going with this. One who isn't inclined towards either side, becoming or not, here or beyond, who has no entrenchment when considering what's grasped among doctrines, hasn't the least theorized perception with regard to what's seen, heard, or sensed. Again, put this in that framework that we just talked about of the Tathagata, who's just not letting you land on the nature or quality of their existence or non-existence. If that's where you are, then by whom, with what, could you possibly be pigeonholed in the world? There is no way anybody could put you in a box. If that's the way that you experienced, manifested, communicated, so forth, right? Don't theorize, don't yearn, don't adhere even to doctrines. A Brahman, and this is referring, the Brahman here, this is Buddha as the reformist. To him, Brahman wasn't by birth. The proper reading of the caste system, I can't remember the correct word, it's not caste, but there's another word which begins with a V, which is about these 4 categories. These categories in the early teachings of the Sanatana Dharma are categories based on attribute, not based on birth, based on predisposition and training, not based on birth. So the Buddha, Brahman, wasn't by birth, it was by practice. So this is a Brahman. A Brahman not led by habits or practices, gone to the beyond. Gone to the beyond is another way of framing this. What is a Tathagata after death? Such, another way of saying it, doesn't fall back. That's often framed as at the end of the turning of the wheel, that first teaching. I've done that which had to be done. There will be no more becoming, no more birth. Doesn't mean that Tathagata doesn't show up, because that's not a birth. Nothing's born, right? This is the kind of a contradiction, if you will. It's not a contradiction, but it's a not landing in the idea of a bodhisattva. If it's a Buddha showing up, they're not really reborn, because there's nobody there. You read Ajahn Chah, there's nobody there. You read Nisargadatta, Sri Ramana Maharshi, there's nobody there. So this is not saying that an individual should not be engaged in the world. It's not saying that we don't cease suffering, move towards suffering, offer compassion, work towards the ending of suffering. What it is saying is that if in our effort to do that we start supporting any individual doctrines, we hold up particular views as my view, the right view, we're getting ourselves in trouble and we're going off track, and we're actually causing suffering and getting ourselves entangled in suffering and not working to bring suffering to an end. And I used it earlier, the koan of the ox's tail. The ox is trying to get through the window, head through, shoulders through, legs, body, back legs. It can't get the tip of its tail through. Why can't it get the tip of its tail through? It's that last little thing. As long as we're carrying a view, we're not through the window, and we're going to be causing friction in our engagements. If there's a view that we're attached to about this is the right belief system, that belief system's wrong, we're going to get caught in the window. Alright, I think I've talked enough.